There is a building in Midtown Manhattan with no sign on the door, no logo in the lobby directory. If you called the number listed on its incorporation filing, you would reach a receptionist trained to say, politely, that she cannot confirm who the company represents. Inside, roughly 40 people go to work every day. Tax attorneys, portfolio managers who used to run trading desks at Goldman Sachs, a former State Department diplomat who now handles family diplomacy, which is a polite way of saying he prevents siblings from suing each other, an art curator, a private security consultant, a person whose entire job is to read philanthropic grant proposals and quietly decline the ones that would embarrass the family name. None of them work for a company you have heard of. They work for a family, one family, a family whose surname you might recognize from a hospital wing, a university library, or a wine label, and whose actual operating structure you have never been taught to see. This is a family office, and it is, without exaggeration, the central piece of financial machinery that separates wealth that lasts 3 generations from wealth that lasts 12. Today we are going inside it, what it is, what it actually does hour by hour, who staffs it, what it costs to build one, and why almost nobody outside of this world has ever had it properly explained to them. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. The institution nobody names on purpose. Let's start with a definition, because the term family office gets thrown around loosely, usually by people trying to sound like they understand a world they've only read about on LinkedIn. A family office is a private company, legally an actual registered entity, created for the sole purpose of managing the financial and personal affairs of one wealthy family, or in some structures, a small handful of related families. It is not a bank. It is not a wealth management firm you'd find advertised in an airport lounge magazine. It does not have clients in the plural sense, because it typically has exactly one client, the family that owns it. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A traditional private bank or wealth manager is compensated, in part, by selling you products, funds, insurance vehicles, structured notes, because that's how their revenue model works. Even the most well-intentioned private banker is, at the end of the day, employed by a bank that answers to its own shareholders. A family office employee answers to the family. Full stop. There is no second master, no product quota, no incentive to recommend the investment that pays the best commission instead of the one that's actually best for the family's goals. This single structural difference, the alignment of interest, is the entire reason family offices exist, and it's the first thing almost nobody explains clearly. The concept isn't new. Historians generally trace the modern family office back to the House of Morgan and to the Rockefeller family, who in 1882 formalized what had been an informal group of accountants and advisors into a structured entity to manage the family's oil fortune after Standard Oil's rapid expansion made informal bookkeeping impossible. But the underlying idea, a dedicated administrative apparatus built around a fortune rather than around a bank's product line, goes back much further, arguably to the stewards and major domos who managed the estates of European nobility for centuries before the term family office was ever coined. What makes the modern version different is scale and sophistication. Today's family office isn't a single trusted accountant with a ledger book. It is, in the case of the largest ones, a fully staffed private financial institution, sometimes larger and more capitalized than a boutique investment bank, built to do one thing extraordinarily well: preserve and grow a specific family's capital across generations while insulating that family from the operational noise of managing it themselves. Industry researchers estimate there are now several thousand single-family offices operating globally, managing collectively several $1 trillion in assets. That's not a rounding error in the global economy. That's a parallel financial system, operating almost entirely outside the public eye, managing more capital in aggregate than many countries' sovereign wealth funds. And most people watching this video have never once heard the term used correctly. So, why don't we hear about it? Not because it's illegal, not because it's secret in the cloak and dagger sense. It's because a family office has zero incentive to be visible. It doesn't advertise. It doesn't need new clients. It has one. It doesn't need brand recognition, because brand recognition for a structure built around discretion is a liability rather than an asset. The absence of a name on the door isn't paranoia. It's product design. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Someone who wants the actual mechanics, not the aesthetic. Hit subscribe now, because in the next section, we're going to break down the two very different types of family office, and which one actually makes financial sense depending on your net worth. Single family versus multifamily. Two very different machines. There are two fundamentally different structures hiding under the same term, and conflating them is the single most common mistake people make when they talk about this world. The single-family office, SFO, is built for and funded by exactly one family. It exists solely to serve their interests, employs staff whose only loyalty is to that family, and is typically only economically justifiable once a family's investable assets cross somewhere in the range of $100 million to $250 million. Below that threshold, the fixed operating costs of running a private institution, the attorneys, the compliance staff, the office lease, the technology infrastructure, simply eat too large a percentage of the returns to make sense. It's the financial equivalent of chartering a private jet to fly one person to the grocery store. Technically possible, not remotely efficient. The multifamily office, MFO, by contrast, serves several unrelated wealthy families under one shared operational roof. Think of it as a boutique country club version of a private bank. Families pool the overhead cost of the infrastructure, the legal team, the investment research desk, the tax specialists, while still receiving individually tailored strategy. Unlike the largely standardized products you'd get from a retail wealth management arm of a major bank, MFOs typically become the entry point for families in the $20 million to $100 million range. Substantial wealth, but not quite enough to justify building a private institution from scratch. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. The decision between these two isn't just about cost. It's about a trade-off between privacy and efficiency that echoes something we've covered before on this channel. The tension between visibility and control that runs through everything old money builds, from anonymous LLC structures to blind trusts. A single-family office offers maximum privacy and maximum control. Every employee's loyalty is singular. There is no risk that your family's investment strategy gets discussed, even accidentally, in a meeting about another client. There is no risk that a departing employee takes institutional knowledge about your family's affairs to a competitor family across the hall. But you pay for that privacy in overhead, typically running costs of $1 million to $3 million or more annually, just to keep the lights on, before a single investment decision has even been made. A multifamily office trades some of that exclusivity for economic efficiency and, Frequently, deeper specialized expertise, because an MFO serving 12 families can afford to hire a genuine expert in, say, international art financing or cross-border trust structuring. A specialist a single family alone likely couldn't justify employing full-time. There's a third, quieter category worth naming, because old money families increasingly use it as a stepping stone. The embedded office, where family affairs are handled inside an existing operating business the family controls. Historically common among industrial and merchant dynasties, who simply folded the family's personal financial administration into the accounting department of the family enterprise itself, before eventually spinning it off as its own entity once the operating business was sold or restructured. The Wallenberg family in Sweden is frequently cited as an example of wealth administration deeply intertwined with controlled holding companies and foundations, rather than a conventional standalone family office in the American sense. And Bidenkafen, important structural distinction worth understanding, since European and American models diverge meaningfully. What determines which path a family takes isn't just current net worth. It's philosophy. Some families with well over $500 million in assets deliberately choose to stay inside a well-run multifamily office indefinitely because they've concluded that the marginal privacy benefit of building a private institution isn't worth the marginal cost and management burden of running one. Building a single-family office is, in a very real sense, starting a company. And not every family wants to be in the business of running a company whose only product is itself. What actually happens inside, hour by hour. This is the section people are usually most surprised by, because popular culture has trained us to imagine a family office as essentially a hedge fund with a nicer lobby. It isn't. Investment management is only one function among many, and often not even the largest one by head count. Let's walk through what a mature, single-family office actually does on an average Tuesday. Investment management sits at the center, obviously. But this isn't stock picking in the retail sense. It's asset allocation across public equities, private equity, real assets, direct deals, and increasingly co-investment opportunities alongside institutional partners. A family office investment team spends much of its time not managing money directly, but managing the outside managers who manage the money, conducting due diligence on hedge funds, private equity vehicles, and venture funds before capital is committed, then monitoring those managers' performance and behavior over years or decades. Tax strategy and compliance is a near constant operation, not an annual event. For a family with assets and beneficiaries spread across multiple countries, which is increasingly the norm rather than the exception among old money families. This means coordinating tax filings across jurisdictions, monitoring changes in estate and gift tax law, and structuring transactions in ways that are fully compliant but that minimize unnecessary tax drag. We've covered the mechanics of this in our previous video on Buy, Borrow, Die. A family office is frequently the entity actually executing that strategy in practice, coordinating the lending banks, the collateral valuations, and the trust structures simultaneously. Estate planning and trust administration is where a family office does some of its quietest and most consequential work. Trusts need trustees. Trustees need to make distribution decisions, file accountings, and interface with beneficiaries. Sometimes beneficiaries who are minors, sometimes beneficiaries who are estranged from the rest of the family. A family office frequently houses in-house trust officers whose entire job is administering the dozens, sometimes hundreds, of trust instruments a multi-generational family has accumulated over decades of estate planning. Risk management and insurance covers everything from standard liability coverage to highly specialized products, kidnap and ransom insurance for families with international exposure, fine art and collectibles coverage requiring independent appraisal networks, and increasingly cybersecurity risk assessment, given how much of a family's sensitive financial data now exists digitally. Philanthropic administration runs the family's foundation or donor-advised fund, vets grant proposals, ensures compliance with private foundation payout requirements, and, this part matters, protects the family from reputational risk by declining donations or partnerships that could embarrass the family name. We touched on this in our anonymous philanthropy video. A family office is very often the entity structuring gifts, specifically to keep the family's name off the building, not on it. Property and lifestyle management handles what's sometimes called concierge services, though that word undersells it. Coordinating staff across multiple residences, managing aircraft or yacht logistics, overseeing art collection storage and insurance, and handling the genuinely mundane administrative burden of running several households simultaneously. Data security and digital infrastructure has quietly become one of the fastest-growing functions inside modern family offices, and it's rarely discussed outside the industry. A family with significant assets, multiple properties, and a recognizable name is a genuinely attractive target for cybercrime. Everything from phishing attempts aimed at wiring money out of accounts to more sophisticated attempts to compromise a family member's devices in order to gather information for physical security threats. Sophisticated offices now employ dedicated cybersecurity staff, run regular penetration testing on internal systems, and increasingly restrict which family members and staff have access to which categories of sensitive financial data. Treating information architecture with the same rigor a bank would apply to protecting depositor funds. Family governance and next-generation education is, in the most sophisticated offices, treated as seriously as the investment function. This means running family meetings, coordinating the kind of family constitution work we detailed in an earlier video, and running structured financial education programs for heirs. Because a family office's job isn't just to manage money for the current generation, it's to prepare the next one to eventually take over that management, or at least to be competent stewards and informed overseers of the professionals who do. Notice what's absent from that list. Nothing here is exotic or illegal. It's simply comprehensive. The function of a family office isn't to hide money. It's to eliminate the hundreds of small administrative and strategic decisions that would otherwise consume the family's own time and attention, and to ensure those decisions are made by specialists rather than by amateurs, however wealthy or well-intentioned those amateurs might be. Here's a question for the comments. Knowing what you now know about what these offices actually do day to day, is this something you'd want? Or does it sound like a full-time job you'd rather not sign up for even with unlimited money? I read every comment on these videos, and I want to know where you land. The talent behind the curtain. Who actually works at one of these places? This is where the secret machine framing starts to make literal sense, because the staffing model of a family office looks almost nothing like a normal company's org chart. At the top typically sits a chief executive officer or chief investment officer, and increasingly these are separated into two distinct roles as offices mature, because running the operational and governance side of a family's affairs requires a fundamentally different skill set than managing a 9-figure investment portfolio. These individuals are frequently recruited directly from institutional finance, former partners at private equity firms, former heads of trading desks at major banks. lured away from prestigious, high-visibility careers by two things: compensation that can rival or exceed what they'd earn at a public firm, and, just as importantly, the appeal of working with genuinely aligned, patient, long-term capital instead of quarterly earnings-obsessed institutional shareholders. Below that sits a team that typically includes a general counsel or in-house legal team, handling everything from contract review to coordinating outside counsel on complex cross-border matters. Because at this scale, outside law firm hours add up fast enough that bringing legal expertise in-house becomes economically rational. Tax specialists, often CPAs with a specific subspecialty in high net worth and multi-jurisdictional taxation, a genuinely rare skill set because most accountants never encounter the kind of cross-border, multi-entity tax questions a global family generates routinely. Trust and estate officers, frequently trained attorneys who specialize specifically in fiduciary administration. Investment analysts and portfolio managers, sometimes organized by asset class. Public markets, private equity, real assets, direct deals, mirroring the structure of an institutional asset manager rather than a retail brokerage. And then, in the more sophisticated offices, a set of roles that would surprise most people: family governance facilitators, sometimes with backgrounds in organizational psychology or conflict mediation, whose entire job is managing the human dynamics of the family itself. Because, as we've discussed on this channel before, the single greatest threat to generational wealth isn't market risk. It's family conflict. A family office that spends money on a skilled governance facilitator is, in effect, buying insurance against the single most statistically common cause of dynastic wealth failure. Compensation at the senior level of major single-family offices can rival or exceed comparable roles at institutional asset managers, particularly because family offices can offer something Wall Street increasingly struggles to: genuinely long-term thinking, freedom from quarterly performance pressure, and frequently meaningfully better work-life structure, since a family office isn't managing thousands of external clients' competing demands simultaneously. What ties all of these roles together is something worth naming explicitly. Discretion is a job requirement, not a personality trait. Every employee, from the CIO to the household staff coordinator, typically signs non-disclosure agreements as a condition of employment. This isn't paranoia. It's the direct consequence of a structure built entirely around one family's privacy. The confidentiality isn't a cultural quirk. It's contractual architecture. The Anchor case, how the Rockefellers built the template. If you want to understand why the modern family office exists in its current form, there is no better anchor case than the Rockefeller family, a name that appears repeatedly across this channel's library, precisely because so much of the modern architecture of dynastic wealth preservation traces directly back to decisions this family made more than a century ago. After the extraordinary success of Standard Oil in the late 19th century, John D. Rockefeller faced a problem that had no established playbook. How do you administer a fortune of unprecedented scale using the informal advisory relationships that had sufficed for smaller family wealth? The answer was to formalize what had previously been ad hoc, creating a dedicated office staffed with attorneys, accountants, and investment advisors whose sole function was managing the family's capital, philanthropic commitments, and eventually the affairs of an expanding number of Rockefeller descendants across multiple branches of the family tree. What made this structure genuinely innovative wasn't just its existence. Wealthy families had employed stewards and advisors for centuries. It was the degree of professionalization. Rather than relying on generalist family friends or a single trusted lawyer, the Rockefeller office brought in genuine specialists, created formal reporting structures, and treated the management of family wealth as a discipline in its own right, rather than an informal courtesy extended by whichever advisor happened to be available. This mattered enormously for succession. A fortune managed by one aging, irreplaceable advisor dies, functionally, if not literally, the moment that advisor retires or passes away, because all of the institutional knowledge lived in one person's head. A fortune managed by a structured institution with documented processes, multiple specialists, and formal succession planning for the staff itself survives the departure of any single individual. This is the exact same principle, applied at the level of the office itself, that family governance structures apply at the level of the family. Resilience comes from institutionalized process, not from dependence on any single irreplaceable person. The Rockefeller model also established something else that's become standard practice across the industry: the deliberate separation of the family's philanthropic apparatus from its investment apparatus, even while housing both under a related organizational umbrella. This is why, when we discuss anonymous philanthropy on this channel, the mechanics almost always run through foundation structures that are legally and operationally distinct from the family's core investment entity, even when both report, ultimately, to the same family. It's worth being explicit here, in keeping with this channel's editorial standard. This is not a story about secrecy for its own sake, and it is not evidence of anything improper. Every structure described in this section operates within and because of well-established legal frameworks for trusts, foundations, and private corporations, frameworks available, in principle, to anyone who meets the relevant legal and financial thresholds. The Rockefeller family office isn't a loophole. It's an early and unusually well-documented example of what happens when a family takes the administration of wealth as seriously as the wealth itself. If this case study interests you, we go much deeper on the philanthropic side of exactly this kind of family architecture in our video on anonymous giving. Link in the description, and it's a natural companion piece to this one. The cost of admission, what it actually takes to build one. Let's talk numbers with the appropriate caveats, because this is the part viewers most often ask about. Building and operating a single-family office is not cheap, and it is not linear. Costs don't scale smoothly with assets under management the way a percentage-based advisory fee would. There's a large fixed cost component, regardless of whether a family has $150 million or $1.5 billion, because you need a functioning legal team, a functioning tax team, and functioning technology infrastructure at almost any scale of operation, once you cross the threshold of justifying an SFO at all. Industry benchmarking studies generally place the all-in annual cost of running a single-family office somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 basis points of assets under management for smaller offices, with that percentage typically declining as assets scale up, since fixed costs get spread across a larger capital base. In dollar terms, this frequently means a range of roughly $1 million to $5 million or more annually for a mid-sized single-family office, scaling upward significantly for the largest, most fully staffed operations serving multi-billion-dollar family fortunes. This is precisely why the multifamily office model exists and continues to grow. It lets families access most of the same specialized expertise, the same caliber of tax attorney, the same caliber of investment due diligence, while sharing that fixed cost across several client families instead of bearing it alone. There's a second cost that rarely gets discussed, and it's not financial: organizational complexity. Building a single-family office means, functionally, founding and running a company, with all the governance, hiring, management, and succession challenges that implies. Recruiting and retaining senior investment and legal talent requires competitive compensation and genuine professional development opportunities, which means even a successful single-family office has to think about its own institutional longevity almost as carefully as it thinks about the family's wealth. This is why many family offices, once they reach a certain scale and sophistication, eventually convert, either partially or fully, into multi-family offices themselves, opening their doors to a small number of additional families. It's not necessarily a sign of financial strain. It's frequently a deliberate decision to convert a fixed cost center into a modest additional revenue stream, and, less discussed, to give talented senior staff a broader mandate and career growth path that a single client structure simply can't offer on its own. There's also a timing dimension to this decision that rarely gets discussed. Families rarely wake up one day and decide to build a single-family office from a standing start. More commonly, the structure emerges gradually. A wealthy individual sells an operating business in a liquidity event, and the small internal finance team that once managed payroll and vendor contracts for that business slowly transforms into something closer to an investment and administrative office as the family's needs shift from running a company to managing the proceeds of having sold one. This organic evolution explains why so many family offices, when you examine their origin stories closely, trace back not to a deliberate founding moment, but to an existing team that simply kept working after the underlying business changed hands. The honest bottom line, stated plainly, a family office is not a purchase most families will ever make, and that's by design, not by accident. It exists specifically for a tier of wealth, generally, per the industry benchmarks referenced above, upward of $100 million in investable assets, at which the complexity of managing that capital exceeds what any individual family member, however capable, can reasonably do themselves alongside the rest of their life. Below that threshold, the multi-family office and traditional private wealth management structures generally offer better economics for comparable expertise. We're building out a full library on exactly this kind of institutional architecture: family constitutions, trust structuring, buy, borrow, die, and now, family offices. If you want the next installment the moment it goes live, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel doesn't do filler content, so you won't be spammed. Why this isn't hidden, it's just never taught. Let's close by addressing the framing directly, because it matters for how you should think about everything we've just covered. None of this is conspiracy. Every structure described in this video, the entity formation, the trust administration, the tax planning, the governance frameworks, exists within well-documented, entirely legal financial and legal architecture. Family offices file the same categories of tax returns, operate under the same fiduciary duty standards, and are subject to the same securities and banking regulations as any other financial entity of comparable function. There is no hidden rulebook here. There is, however, a knowledge and access gap. And that gap is worth naming honestly. The reason most people have never heard a clear explanation of what a family office actually is isn't that the information is classified. It's that the information has never had an obvious audience. Financial media covers hedge funds and public markets because that's where retail investor attention and advertising dollars are. Business schools teach corporate finance and investment banking because that's where the largest number of graduates will build careers. Almost nobody builds a curriculum around how does a fortune structure itself to survive 100 years, because the audience for that curriculum has historically been small enough and wealthy enough to simply hire someone rather than learn it themselves. That's the actual mechanism behind the phrase this channel returns to again and again. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. Nobody sat down and decided that ordinary people shouldn't understand family office structures. There was simply never an economic incentive for anyone to teach it broadly, until, perhaps, now. Because here's the part worth sitting with as we close. You don't need $100 million to benefit from understanding this. The underlying principles, separating decision-making from emotion, institutionalizing expertise instead of relying on a single advisor, treating governance as seriously as investment strategy, building processes that survive any one individual's departure, scale down. A family with $2 million in investable assets can't justify a chief investment officer. But that same family can absolutely benefit from asking the same structural questions a $500 million family office asks. Who actually has fiduciary duty to us, specifically, rather than to a product line? Is our estate plan a document sitting in a drawer or a living process someone actually revisits? Are we preparing the next generation to be informed stewards or just eventual recipients? The machine behind old money isn't a secret. It's a set of disciplined answers to ordinary questions, applied with more resources and more consistency than most people ever apply to their own financial lives. That's genuinely all it is, and now you understand it better than the vast majority of people who will ever hear the term family office used casually and nod along without knowing what it actually means. If this video actually taught you something today, that's the entire point of this channel. Do me a favor and share it with one person who'd find this genuinely interesting, not just impressive. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go inside exactly how these families structure the trusts we've only briefly mentioned today.